I'll kick off now. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome and thank you for joining us today. In New Zealand, it's the morning. For the Catch of the Day satellite activity in the current March Virtual Lab series. We're really pleased to have you here with us and to support the UN Decade activities in this way. I'll kick off this morning with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mai, kina kina ki uta, kia mai, taratara ki tai, e hiki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. So that was a prayer calling the winds from the west and the east to blow over the land and sea of the dawn with a touch of frost to give us the promise of a glorious day. So I think that's a really nice start. It is, the sun's just coming up over the hills in Wellington where I live. So I think that's quite poignant. The New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO is really pleased to support the Virtual Lab series. And we would like to extend our thanks to our speakers today, to Ding Palomares and Beth Polidoro from the Marine Stewardship Council. We're really pleased to have international speakers. This is in keeping with the vision of the decade to develop new solutions to address the decline in ocean health. I would also like to thank Dr. Carolyn Lundquist for developing the concept for this session in her capacity as a member of our National Oceans Decade Committee. The New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO's contribution to the Oceans Decade are driven by a multidisciplinary approach with Mātauranga Māori and Indigenous knowledge at the core of our work. In terms of our decade work streams, this has included the development of our National Decade Committee and the development of a web platform called Te Tini a Tangaroa. Carolyn, could you flick to I think the third slide? Next one, sorry, the one with the Te Tini, yeah. So I encourage you all to have a look at this interactive website, which showcases the breadth and depth of New Zealand ocean science. We are also working to encourage deeper and better regional and international connections in New Zealand ocean science during the decade, and activities like the satellite activity and the Virtual Lab series as part of our work to do that. I'll hand over now to Carolyn Lundquist to chair the session.
Great, and thank you, Suleika. So welcome everyone. I know there are a few of you out there, and we've also recorded the session, so we're hoping to share it with those that weren't able to come, because we know it's an awkward time, certainly in New Zealand at 8 in the morning. Many people aren't in the office yet, and it's about 8 o'clock in Central Europe as well. So not an ideal time, but hopefully we were able to reach a lot of people, and many we can reach through the recording. So our webinar today, this is part of the UNESCO Virtual Labs, and it's one of two that we have scheduled. So the second part will be at the end of May, June 1st, I think is possibly the actual date. We're waiting on that. And we're really looking forward to that one because we have a special citizen science activity in the middle. And so the concept of this lab is really about how much do we know about the fish that we eat. So what do we know as consumers about sustainability, about sustainable practices, and how can our own behaviors and our own choices influence and increase the sustainability of our fisheries around the world. And so the activity we have in the middle is a survey, and Amy Clark, a former UNESCO intern over the summer, will introduce that at the end of the presentation. But we're very much looking forward to that and to our second webinar. Now, today's webinar, what we'll be mostly talking about is fisheries and sustainable practices. And I'm a marine ecologist. I work at NIWA, which is the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research in New Zealand, and also at the University of Auckland in the School of Environment. I'm a marine ecologist, but I do quite a bit of work on fisheries more in the aspects of managing bycatch to the seafloor, so seafloor trawling, and also marine spatial planning. So how do we maximize what we get out of fisheries while also protecting the environment? So the question for you is, what actually makes fish or fisheries sustainable? And you probably hear that that's a bit of a buzzword, and sustainable means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And a lot of the typical words that we hear out there in terms of what makes fisheries sustainable is that we want it to be minimizing bycatch. So when you're pulling fish up in your net, you want to be catching really the fish that you're wanting to sell, and not a lot of other things, whether it be fish that are smaller or too small to be sold. You don't want to be catching other animals that live on the bottom, such as sponges or bryozoans or deep sea corals. You want to be minimizing seafloor impacts. So as well as catching the animals, bottom trawling can often have fairly large impacts on the seafloor as well, both in impacting on the animals that live there, but also in resuspending sediments. And within a lot of our fisheries, certainly where we are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're promoting an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries, or EBFM. And that basically implies that we're keeping these different parts of the environment within that management system. So considering not just the fish that we're catching, but also that more holistic ecosystem when considering what we do about managing fisheries. A number of other things are brought in as management measures to make fish more sustainable, such as size limits. We often want to look at where a fish was caught. Was it caught locally and transported locally, or is it something that was caught, for example, again, in New Zealand? Much of our, for example, greenlet fishery stocks, our rock lobster and our hoki, as I'll show in a minute, is exported all around the world. So that's adding these climate change costs, our carbon costs of transport into the equation of sustainability. And then there are a whole bunch of things about management. So do we have stock assessments? Are they updated regularly? Does a fishery have catch quotas? Does that mean, does it have a maximum you're allowed to catch? And do people actually use that to manage the fishery? And what's going to happen with our fisheries in the future? Do we have any fail-safes to make sure that our fisheries are climate safe? So those are just a large number of things that often come into our discussions of whether fisheries are sustainable. Now, fisheries management itself is a complicated beast, and Dang will show a bit more about global fisheries. I'll just give you some very quick examples of what goes on where I am here in New Zealand. We actually have a quota management system, and most countries in the world don't manage fisheries this way, but it's basically, we have a privatized fishing system where you need a license to fish, and you need to own quota for any of the stocks that you capture. We do have nearly 100 different species that are part of our fishery management system, and those are divided by area into different stocks. So some species may be, as in this picture on the right, divided into about 10 or a dozen stocks around New Zealand, and others may only be 1 or 2 stocks in New Zealand. And we manage within this quota system where we have a total allowable catch, and that's what the stock assessments determine how much fish you might be able to take out of that larger population within a year without impacting on the ecosystem or the stock health. Now, one thing it's important to know is we don't often evaluate every single fish stock. So of those 600 odd stocks that we have in New Zealand, about 300 of them are what we call nominal stocks. That basically means that they're a very small total amount of catch, so often something that would be caught as bycatch when you're actually targeting a different fishery. But then of the other fisheries, these 2 columns on the top left here, where we have the fisheries stocks that we actually evaluate, that's about 160 in New Zealand. That covers about 69% of the total catch and 85% of the total value. But we do have a large number that we don't have sufficient funding to support their assessment. And that's about 31% of the catch where the stocks aren't assessed. In terms of how are we doing in New Zealand, and again, Deng will give you some numbers for the rest of the world. 131 of the assessed stocks of those 160 are doing well. that they aren't assessed as having any issues with sustainability, but 29 of them are currently in some state of rebuilding. And just to make you aware of some of these types of stocks that are overfished in New Zealand, and this is from a recent report, just a listing of some of the collapsed stocks at the end of 2020. These do include a lot of fish stocks that we are familiar with, whether it be things like orange roughy, pippy is one of our bivalves, and 2 of our tuna species. And we also have a number of other stocks such as snapper, paua, teriki, and these are very common stocks to anyone who's gone to the market in New Zealand. But many of our very common stocks are within these lists of collapsed or overfishing. Now, this does differ depending on how we look at stocks. So how many things have had no sustainability issues? Well, when we look at the total number of stocks themselves, it looks like we have many of our 130 again, where we have no sustainability issues, 29 with some issues, and then there's that very large portion that aren't assessed. But when you actually look at it in terms of the volume of catch or the tons of wet weight of fish that come in or within the catch value, we actually have a much larger proportion that don't have sustainability issues. So I think this is encouraging, whereas these numbers make it look like we have a large proportion of our stocks that we know very little about and that are in bad shape. So New Zealand is nationally does these things to look at sustainability of fishings. There are annual fisheries reports as well as the stock assessments for individual stocks and species. But a lot of our fisheries also go by these global sustainability measures. And one of the most well-known one that Beth will talk about in a little bit more detail is the Marine Stewardship Council. And this is a certification scheme that fisheries can use that basically give them the label to then increase their market understanding that they do have sustainable practices. And of that first slide, when I showed you some of the sustainability kind of metrics, here are a number of things that pop up here as well. But basically, the fishery must be sustainable and conducted in a manner that does not lead to overfishing. Then the fishing operation should also consider the broader environment. So we have that holistic minimize effects on the ecosystem. And that third bit is that the fishery needs to have an effective management system. Now, in terms of what do we have that uses this Marine Stewardship Council certification scheme, about 15% globally of all the wild caught seafood is MSC certified. Now, New Zealand, we're a bit of an outlier here, where about 50% of our fisheries are MSC certified. And one of the ones that actually is a huge reason for that in terms of the amount of catch is our New Zealand hoki. This is our largest fishery in New Zealand, and many Kiwis may not actually know this, but hoki is enjoyed in about 52 different countries because this is one of the main fishes used in McDonald's filet of fish. Who knew that? But this means, as part of that program of sustainability, McDonald's has actually bought into making sure that the fish they use has this MSC stamp of approval. And so that means for New Zealand hoki to be sold and to have entry into that market with McDonald's, this is a very large global market. That means that New Zealand hoki does need to have these sustainability properties of the fisheries. So it's really a kind of great win-win, where we have a certification scheme, and then New Zealand, by doing these sustainable practices, then actually has entry into a large global market. So where are we catching? What are we catching, and where does it all go? These are just some New Zealand numbers. So hoki, this is a grenadier for those who aren't familiar, but hoki is our largest fishery, but then arrow squid, jack mackerel, and southern blue whiting top out those top 4, and those are catch by volume in terms of stocks. And then there are a handful of other things that come in within that top species. So those are the species that we're catching by volume. Again, remember, there are over 600 stocks Every so often you get one like this. This is an Oreo. I just popped a picture up in case no one knew what it looked like. And then where does it all go? So from this picture here on the left is from NOAA Fisheries in the United States, and about 3/4 of the US fisheries go to food for humans. But then our catch is used in a large number of other ways, whether it's for animal food, for fish meal and fish oils, but a whole bunch of other uses that we do have for fish. And I popped one up here just for New Zealand hoki, just in looking at their sustainability plan. So yes, the fillets themselves are used for that human export or market and human consumption, but then a large number of other parts of the fish are also utilized. So the skin, the bones, the heads are all processed into fish meal. The livers are processed into fish oil. And I've just got a picture up here of here's a hoki oil as a pet product. And then there's also been one of the more recent explorations between the fisheries and plant and food. One of our research institutes in New Zealand has come up with a collagen extraction to make an anti-wrinkle cream. So, pretty exciting of the stuff that we do use our fish for. But how much does that affect then in prepping you for our next webinar? What affects what's actually at your local market? Do you see a huge diversity, or is it the same 10 fish every time? Do you know you can always go and in our case get snapper and teriyaki, John Dory, salmon that you can see here? So what actually affects what at your local market? And that'll be a lot of what we're talking about at our next virtual webinar. And just giving you some lovely pictures of some of our more commonly known species in New Zealand. We've got a snapper here at the top. We've got a blue cod here at the top right. Here's the orange ruffy, and there's that hoki at the bottom. So that's what a grenadier looks like. So they're really not the most attractive fish. And there's that one of the Oreos coming in. We actually have quite a few Oreo species. So really what the question we're going to be bringing in our second webinar is then what is our role as fish consumers in sustainability, and do our choices actually influence what is sold and what is captured, and what are different things that we can do to make better choices, whether it's using different fish guides, doing this is one of my former graduate students here catching a rather large snapper, but how can we change our own personal choices to influence sustainability? So that's all from me. So I'll now hang over to Dr. Palomares, and her nickname is Deng. That's what we all know her by. So thank you very much, Deng, and just let me know when you need me to forward the slides. And hold on, I do have an introduction of Deng first though, so let me read that. Deng has been in the Sea Around Us project manager since June 2017, and she's one of the creators and the lead of the Sea Life Base, which has been around since 2005. And this is a global biodiversity information system on marine organisms other than fish. And that's patterned after one of the really important resources that most of us know in marine science called FishBase, which was the fish biodiversity information system on the world's fishes. And there you can look up just about every fish in the world, find its taxonomic information, ecological information, fisheries information, et cetera. And I know certainly we use this in New Zealand quite a bit as well. She helps with molding the scientific thrusts in defining projects and the workflow associated with and producing deliverables in a timely manner of a Philippines NGO called Quantitative Aquatics, and serves as its science director. And she also serves as a specialty chief editor in Frontiers in Marine Sciences special section on marine fisheries, aquaculture, and living resources since 2016. She's originally from the Philippines, and she obtained her PhD from and I'm not going to speak my French very well, from the École Nationale Supérieure Agronomique de Toulouse in France. How was that? In 1991, and then she's worked with the FishBase project both in Manila before joining the Sea Around Us team in British Columbia in 2001. So thank you, Deng.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I don't know which time frame everybody's working with. So I am with the Sea Around Us, and the Sea Around Us is a research initiative at the University of British Columbia. It assesses the impact of fisheries on, oh, I have my first slide, please. Sorry. Yes, first slide. So the Sea Around Us assesses the impact of fisheries on the world's marine ecosystems. We emphasize the catch time series starting from 1950, and at this update we have 2018, and related series, for example, landed value, catch by flag state, fishing sector, and catch type, and other fisheries related information on every maritime country in the world, for instance, government subsidies and marine biodiversity. Now, our data is freely available on the World Wide Web, and some of it can be downloaded via the download button, which I have there, and in CSV formats. And users can contact us through the feedback link. Next slide, please. So the Sea Around Us was founded by Daniel Pauly in 1999 with funding from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And this funding from the Pew continued for 15 years, which enabled the Sea Around Us to work on the reconstructions of catch time series. This method is like solving a puzzle. Now, my family is keen on puzzles, and usually when we start with a puzzle, we start with looking for the pieces that make the borders. And with the border pieces in the Sea Around Us, coming from the FAO fisheries statistics reported catches, so that's reported data. And a fundamental piece of this puzzle being that done, we can then now find the pieces to fill in the gaps in the middle, which means looking for published material like history of the fishery on subsistence and recreational fisheries, mostly fisheries that are not reported in the FAO database. We also have national reports on supplementary information like catch per unit of effort per fisher, which we can use to fill in the gaps, or the number of fishers in the country, or even the per capita fish consumed in the country. Now, other reported information can come from newspaper articles, for example, on illegal fisheries being caught by. This reconstruction work culminated in the Atlas of Marine Fisheries that was published in 2016 with over 400 collaborators worldwide from over 200 countries. Now, the best work, this work is the basis of all the data that we now provide on the website. Next slide, please. This global fisheries data that was provided in 2016 was instrumental in providing a first analysis of the global trends in fisheries. And this was published in Nature Communications by Pauly and by Daniel and Dirk Zeller in 2016. And the result being that the world's fisheries peaked in 1996 and has since declined by an average of 1.2 million tons per year. Now, the reported catch emulate this finding, but with a much decreased rate of 0.4 million tons per year. Several results based on the Sea Around Us data set had been released. And next slide, please. One of the more recent work that we had published is that based on the catch reconstructions and an analysis of the biomass trends in the world's oceans and climate zones. This work was based on 1,300 populations with catch data and supplementary information based on stock assessments and biological data. We find that most of the global, the oceans the biomass trends in most of the oceans are actually declining, except in some areas where you have a really good how do you say that, management, like in the Pacific Ocean, Northeast Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. With this first assessment of the biomass trends, we continued working on this and in an attempt to provide an idea of how much fish is left in the oceans. And this is the result of a partnership with the Mindoro Foundation's Flourishing Oceans Initiative. Now, since we had finished that only in 2021, I would like to show you an example of what these results might be in the next slide. And this is an example for FAO Area 21, the Northeast Atlantic. This is a picture of the biomass left in this ocean. And it goes from very good, which is green, to very bad, which is red. So what we are finding now is that most of the biomass left in this area is, this is where the cod was, and we know everything about the cod going down the drain. And so that's an easy example. But we now know that it is only, we are showing that it's that the population, the fish biomass left in this region is less than 40% of the original biomass that was observed in 1950. So now this is part of the work that's still unpublished, but we would like to publish this work soon. It has been submitted to the journal and in the process of being reviewed. Now, next slide, please. The sea around us also contains fish subsidies data. And with this data, we are able to show that Asia is by far the greatest subsidizing nation, followed by Europe and North America. This graph suggests that capacity enhancing subsidies are higher than other categories, except in the Americas with higher beneficial subsidies. With the amount of data that we have in the sea around us, we are then able to suggest some general, general statements to fish managers and to civil society at large. Next slide, please. That we should not be subsidizing industrial fisheries, and that we can, if we assess the stocks that we have that are commercially exploited, we can then set conservative quotas, like Caroline has already shown, which allows for rebuilding the biomass of these exploited populations. And maybe it will be good to set up marine reserves to protect marine biodiversity and also mitigate some of the effects of ocean warming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thang. And I was supposed to point out, we do have a time after all of us speak, we'll have a Q&A session, and we do have in your options down at the bottom, you can either put messages preferably in the Q&A tab. So if you can put any questions that you'd like to ask any of the panels there, that's preferred. And you're welcome to use the chat for other conversations, or for example, to tell us where you're from. We'd love to know where the diversity of attendees in our audience are from this year. So I'd now like to introduce our second speaker. Our second panelist is Beth Polidoro, and Beth is the Research Director in Science and Standards of the Marine Stewardship Council, or MSC, that I introduced earlier. And her team provides research support across the MSC, and it also conducts strategic research on the impacts of MSC's programs on marine biodiversity, the environment, and socioeconomic well-being, which is also a big part of MSC certification that's come in recent decades. She recently joined the MSc just this year in 2022, and before that, she was an associate professor of marine conservation at Arizona State University, and also the associate director of Arizona State Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. She also holds a number of positions with IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, including being the co-chair of the Species Survival Commission of the Marine Fishes Specialist Group, and also being a member of the IUCN SSC Marine Conservation Committee. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. I don't have any slides, but I would like to just talk generally with you about some of the ways that we can make sure there's enough fish in the sea for current and future generations. As you may or may not know, there are a number of initiatives around the globe and different tools that we can use to estimate if the fishes that we are catching and selling are being managed sustainably, as well as if they're being sold under labels in the supermarkets that allow for traceability and social accountability. So today I'm just going to talk really briefly about one of those initiatives that the MSC, it's their primary mission. It's the largest global organization in the across the planet that offers two different types of certifications that allow us to assess the sustainability of fisheries. That's one of them that Caroline talked about a little bit earlier. And the second one, it certifies seafood supply chains and businesses that directly provide seafood products to the public. So the first one, the MSC Fisheries Standard, is something that Caroline touched on a little earlier. And this is our standard that certifies fisheries sustainable practices. Now, it's important to mention that both of these certifications that MSC offers are not actually conducted by MSC. They're conducted by third parties. So it's almost like a peer review. The MSC provides the standards and maintains the guidelines for how to implement the standards, but the certification itself are done by third parties, by conformity assessment bodies. And so in this way, it remains an objective peer-reviewed process. So the first standard that Caroline talked a little bit about is our fisheries standard, and that's based on 3 principles. The first one has to do with assessing the actual impact of the fishery on the species it's targeting. What is the biomass? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it being sustainably harvested? Is there a harvest management strategy in place? The second part of that certification for a fishery has to do with how is that fishery impacting the ecosystem and the environment? How is it impacting the habitat or endangered or threatened species? What is the bycatch like? Are they monitoring the bycatch? What are pollution aspects of that fishery? And then the third principle has to do with assessing and scoring that fishery's governance and management system. In other words, do they have a monitoring and evaluation system in place? Are they conducting regular compliance and enforcement processes? Do they have a protocol in place for enforcement and compliance? Do they have a formal decision-making process and procedure in order to make changes or improvements in the fishery? And so a fishery is scored against different indicators within these 3 components to come up with an overall score that allows them to be considered certified, or maybe if they have to make improvements, they can have some conditions put on that certification so that they can make improvements and become fully certified. Currently, there are about 500 MSC certified fisheries across the globe, which collectively represent about 16 million tons of seafood, or as previously referenced, about 15% of all wild marine catches, and with another 2% in the assessment process at the moment. And then the second standard that I'd like to talk to you about today, which I think is one that people may or may be more familiar with. If you go to the grocery store and you see the MSC blue fish label on that can of tuna fish or on that frozen fish, that has to do with certification through our chain of custody standard. And the chain of custody standard is based on 5 principles, and it allows a seafood business or supplier to be considered sustainable. And these 5 principles have to do with, number one, is the seafood supplier purchasing seafood from another certified fishery, right? Is it coming from a certified fishery? Number two, is the certified product being clearly displayed on the label so that it's clear that it's coming from a sustainable source? Number three, are they able to separate non-certified and certified products in their marketing and in their production of different seafood products? Number four, is there a clear traceability pathway on the source and volumes of the product? In other words, do we know, through the supply chain where that seafood has come from, and has it remained, labeled and sourced and quantified correctly throughout the entire supply chain? And then fifth, is there a management system in place to be able to track and trace and account for all these different variables that allow for sustainable marketing and labeling? And then there's also a few special clauses in this chain of custody standard and exemptions, including one, for example, that exempts companies that have been successfully prosecuted for a forced or child labor violation in the past 2 years from becoming certified. So more and more we're delving into the social impacts of sustainable fishery practices and marketing and products that are included in our certification processes. And just for fun, a couple of statistics. Currently, there are about 20,000 seafood products sold under the MSC Eco label. This is through our chain of custody standard in 63 different countries across the globe, with more than 46,000 businesses or sites certified. And these include businesses and sites like supermarkets, restaurants, processors, distributors, and warehouses. And so I think one of the goals that that Caroline and the team will be discussing later is maybe a citizen science project. I think it might be interesting to include maybe this chain of custody or search for these eco labels within New Zealand markets as well. And so in summary, we've seen that that as more fisheries and markets get certified, the more additional fisheries and businesses want to become certified. So there's almost like a snowball effect that's based on this increasing need to be more competitive in these markets. So we're seeing our requests for certification growing as a larger proportion of the market becomes certified, because it becomes more more competitive within that market for that business to become certified. And for this reason, MSC actively supports all fisheries in their efforts to improve the environmental performance of their fishing practices and meet these different standards. If you go to our website, we have a Pathway to Sustainability program that focuses specifically on maybe small-scale fisheries and those in developing regions that maybe have need additional support. So perhaps need some information on how to deal with data-limited fisheries, or how to manage stocks under climate change, where we now have shifting stocks, where we're having difficulty allocating to different jurisdictions and management units because the fishes are moving around more. So MSC is developing tools and providing data to help address some of these challenges in decision-making, management, and certification. And I'll end there. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you. So we are ready for questions. If anyone has any questions, if you want to put those in the Q&A box, I'm not sure if you'll be able to, probably not be able to see that, but we do have a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen is usually where it shows up. And I will start out. I may just send one directly back at Beth. So what are some of the examples? I think one of the things I've noticed with MSC is they actually have a whole lot more that they're doing, not just about environmental sustainability. So I think, when many of us had heard of MSC 2 decades ago, all we saw MSC was reducing bycatch and making sure that stocks weren't overfished. But there's that whole section now on labor practices. And what is MSC doing there in terms of affecting labor practices in the fishing industry?
That is a great question. as I mentioned previously, the socioeconomic components of fisheries is a part of the certification process, both for fisheries and for businesses and clients that are looking for the chain of custody standard certification. We do have a new labor policy that was released in September of 2021. I have to admit, as someone that just joined in January, I haven't read the entire thing yet, so. But I know that it's open for comment right now, and they hope to have it finalized. So MSC's position on, child labor, slavery, forced employment, etc., employment with the air brackets there. That's going to be, I believe, finalized this summer, North American summer, so in June or July of 2022. So I wish I could speak more to the details.
Thanks, Beth. All right, and then just looking at some other questions that we've got in here, we have questions from ourselves as well that we've been writing from the team. So one question on the influence of other entities within fisheries management. What are the obstacles that prevent greater stakeholder collaboration or influence on fisheries management? And potentially, does that differ between regions? So is it different in North America than in Asia or the South Pacific? And maybe Deng, did you want to start with that one? And then Beth can respond afterwards.
Yes, definitely. It will be different depending on the region, because you have regions where you have lots of data and that will help with the management, right? So for example, we know that North America is full of data and have, how do you say that, authoritative management bodies, and which actually play a big role in managing the stocks. Now, for example, you have in Southeast Asia, where you don't have that kind of body, and where the data that's being gathered is very, not very well monitored, and so it would be very difficult to use the data coming out of those countries where there is no how do you say that, where you cannot really vouch for the results, because the data going into the assessments are not very reliable. So there is a difference, and there is basically the north-south difference again, because Australia and New Zealand, you will have better assessments and therefore better results coming out of those assessments, reliable results. The other thing is subsidies. Again, I would like to reiterate that there is quite a lot of issues with government subsidizing the ability of fishers to go out there and fish more, which would then impact on the sustainability, and therefore would impact the stamp of approval for such fisheries. Yeah, I think that's where I will stop.
Thanks. Beth, did you have a response to that question?
Sure. So first, I'd like to echo, Deng's comment on just when we're managing a shared resource, we need to all start with the same shared information, and sometimes it's just not possible. Different countries or stakeholder groups, fishery groups have different amounts of information. Maybe some have very little, maybe some have a lot, and that can create an imbalance right there in terms of what gets the management priority tends to be those that have better data. Or maybe they both have data, but they're in totally different formats and they're incompatible, and they don't allow for being mushed together, if you will. So I think that can be an issue with stakeholder collaboration. And I think a growing concern, again, I'll mention, is climate change. And some of these fishes are moving around. They're no longer where they used to be. And so the old allocations and quotas and shared management agreements need to be revisited because the fish are no longer where they used to be. And so this is causing quite a bit of confusion and conflict in some areas, especially, dare I say, the North Atlantic, or even the North Pacific, where we're having trouble really reallocating management quotas because we can't keep track of where the fish are going anymore. Well, we kind of know where they're going, but they're not where they're supposed to be. So those are the two big reasons I think that there's difficulty in stakeholder collaboration. How do we address those? What are some solutions? As a researcher, of course, I'm going to say more research. But I also think, improved communication on what the problem actually is, and maybe coming up with novel approaches to how we allocate and manage shifting stocks or data limited fisheries.
Thanks, Beth. And I know, here in Aotearoa, the changing stock boundaries are quite interesting because with the we've got a lot of our more northern stocks occasionally being seen. So for example, catching snapper down in Dunedin off Otago Harbor is no longer an unusual thing, but the quota isn't allocated down there. I don't have a good idea on the numbers, but you have very different quota allocations across the different areas of the snapper stock. And so that's kind of one of the interesting questions when ITQ, our quota system, came in the 80s, but it's a reasonably slow process of allocating new quota. And does the new quota then turn into a question of only the existing quota holders get access to the new quota, or because it's in a very different region, particularly in terms of our different indigenous groups and our Treaty of Waitangi, how does that change what we might do for allocating new quota in those areas where these stocks are moving?
Exactly. And what's the process as it continues to change? We need a more dynamic and flexible quota allocation system because it's going to keep changing. Yeah, agreed.
So I think or Deng, did you have another response? I see your hand up.
Yes. So I just on the movement of stocks, right? The especially large pelagic stocks and small pelagics, which are actually now feeding the fish meal industry. Now the problem is not only that they are moving, it's also because the managers are defining them in geopolitical definitions, which are not really taking into consideration the ecosystem or their migration patterns. And so in any of those, I believe that in any of those situations where you have a migrating stock, and especially if the migration has to do with spawning or feeding, then there should be a body of knowledge that should be based on that particular migration. And therefore, that if the migration pattern concerns several countries, then these countries should come together and do a multilateral multilateral assessment of the stock and management. Yeah.
So I'm just going to keep following up on that kind of climate change issue. So we've had things brought up about climate change causing stocks to move, but what about things like heat waves? Those are all over the news lately. I know there are big heat waves affecting certainly the Pacific. So certainly between us and Australia and the Tasman Sea, the Pacific around Alaska through California and the California current system. What do we think this is going to mean for productivity? Is this a productivity issue? Is it just fish are going to move somewhere else to colder water? And how do we bring that into sustainability? That's a hard one. Sorry. Who wants to go first?
Maybe I attempt.
Okay.
Right. So fish, we know that the biological reaction to increasing temperature is to move somewhere or follow the column of water that is most with their preferred temperature. And sometimes that preferred temperature would be below the water column, maybe much deeper than what they are what they are used to. So they will be following that, and they will be moving wherever that body of water is moving. So that will be that would most likely affect the management of those stocks, right? And we have to predict which way this population is going to move. So that's one thing, and we know that from the work of William Chung and colleagues, that the tropical belt will most likely be losing many of its fish populations, which are going to move in both towards both poles. But then those fish which cannot move further would most likely be the losers, and they would most likely be um, lost to the ecosystem. So there will be a depopulating, I don't know, depopulation of the tropical belt, and maybe an increase of populations towards the poles. But this is, of course, this is a hypothesis. We don't know what's going to happen on site, because there are other studies now that say that the metabolic reaction of fish is going to most likely change as well. So there are lots of, the science has to be let's say, there are lots of science that needs to be done for us to be able to predict the reaction of fish populations towards climate change or increasing temperatures.
Thanks, Dan. Beth, did you have anything to add?
Just a little story. So actually, you know, I agree with everything that Deng said, and I do have an example of what I believe is the first fish to go extinct from climate change. Not something that we eat, but it's a little Nemo damselfish from the Galapagos Islands. Azurina apalaima is the Latin name. And this fish has not been seen since 1983. And it's believed that has gone extinct because of the increasing frequency and warming of waters around the Galapagos due to climate change. And the same reason that Deng mentioned, it's a very shallow species, and water around the Galapagos is actually quite cold normally. And during these heat waves, the fish is trying to go deeper and deeper to get to cooler water, but because of pressure changes, it's not able to survive in deeper waters. So they think it is extinct. I believe it's critically endangered on the IUCN Red List at the moment, because it's really hard to prove something that's gone extinct, but from all intents and purposes, that hasn't been seen in over 40 years.
Thanks. The cute little Nemo fish. Yeah, and I know, you know, certainly I'm not aware of any climate related extinctions in New Zealand of fish, but we, you know, we do know that on particularly these big heat wave events that we do, you know, obviously have, you know, significant effects on our fishery stocks, particularly our hoki off the West Coast is my understanding. Let's see, what else do we have here? How about, here's one. What are the obstacles to more informed consumer decision-making in relation to sustainable fish consumption? And are some consumers more informed than others? Maybe Beth, if you want to start with that one.
So what are the obstacles to more informed consumer decision-making? I'll start with that one.
Yeah.
I think, well, as a consumer, as well, as a researcher, I do think that there can be a lot of confusion about what products are more sustainable than others, you know, and that's why I think it's really good to look for like a clear label that you can identify with, and doesn't have to be the MSC label, you know, any label that you can identify with as being that, you know, that's sustainably sourced. But I do think sometimes it's not possible to see the label, right? What if you're going to the fish market, or what if you're, buying from, a secondary source? I think it's important to be able to ask questions and to look for the sources that you trust. But in general, I feel like there is a lot of confusion about all the different certification and tools that are out there that talk about sustainable seafood. So I hate to say it, but it's up to the consumer to do do a little bit of homework, do a little bit of Googling, and educate yourself a little bit as much as you can about what are the different options out there, and where can you find products that are sustainably sourced. Because I'll end with just saying again, it's easy to point the fingers at everybody else. Well, the government should be doing more, and the corporations should be doing more, and the NGOs should be doing more to make sure that we have more sustainable seafood. But in the end, it really does come down to the consumer and everybody making a choice. And the collective power of each individual doing that is immense. We're able to make massive change if every individual is, thinking about and making those choices. And we've seen it in certifications. The more things that get certified, the more things that want to be certified, and the more people that choose certifications, certified seafood, sustainable seafood.
And certainly, I know we're seeing that coming through in a lot of restaurants where they'll say we only serve, certified seafood. And, it's pretty interesting. I know probably about a decade ago, I went through one of those. Every single time I order seafood, I'm going to ask, where it was caught. And it was quite surprising how few of your servers had any idea, and you'd be getting, shrimp or prawns. And, most of us know that, the shrimp or prawns to New Zealand tend to be imported. So where did they come from? And often your servers would have no idea, and they'd go back to the kitchen. They'd come back and say, sorry, nobody knows. Yep. But by asking those questions, then, your restaurants start realizing that it's important to them as well. And certainly, just making it part of their decision-making and something they think is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everybody asks those questions, then they're probably going to try to find an answer.
Yeah. But then I think one of the other things I remember noticing, looking at the different fish guides, there's a huge, that uncertainty to the average person who's in the shops, because they're not going to know the difference between stocks and species. Yeah. And so you might have a species like rock lobster, for example, might be perfectly healthy in one part of, we'll just say New Zealand, for example. So the Gisborne stocks might be doing wonderfully and supporting a lot of the market, whereas the Harkey Gulf stocks have crashed and aren't doing well at all. And so there's the perception, then do you buy rock lobster? Because you don't know where it's from. So, often our labeling doesn't show where the fish comes from. And I remember swordfish and those would have been, I think, North American stocks being one of those big issues as well, because one of them had completely crashed, and that was that Perfect Storm movie, I think, that people have probably seen, but that one wasn't doing well. That was heavily overfished, but another swordfish stock was actually okay. And that was the one you were buying in the market, but because of all of the bad press on the one that was poorly fished, it was actually affecting people being willing to purchase the one that was actually sustainably managed. So that confusion, it is really tough to figure out, well, what do we buy? What do we not buy?
And just to jump on that, that's one of the reasons the chain of custody standard was developed, because it certifies that when you see that label, it means it comes from sustainably certified fisheries. And that stock kind of issue that you're talking about is like included in that. So it is certifying the stock. So that was exactly one of the problems that it helped to alleviate, I believe.
Yeah. Thank you. Thing, did you have?
Yes, I have a little story because we live in Vancouver, and Vancouver is a very how do you say that the Vancouverites are very up to date with this kind of information. So here we have what we call the Ocean-wise certification. And Ocean-wise is all over the place, even in cans. If you have something that is certified Ocean-wise, it means that it has been sustainably fished and processed. And many of the restaurants here do have that ocean-wise thing on their seafood products. Now, the little story that I have is I don't know if you remember the story with shark fin soup, and when there was a huge global, worldwide reaction to shark fin soup, and as a group, the Sea Around Us, we used to go pre-COVID. We used to go we did restaurant what you call it, get-togetherness once a month, and we went to this restaurant, and the first thing that we looked for was, is there a certification? Well, there wasn't, but then we thought, okay, let's look again, and they were selling shark fin soup. So we decided as a group, we were like 15 people in one big table. We all stood up and we said, everybody who are here, you have to know that shark fin soup should not be consumed. And we said it all together. We decided we will do this. And we stood up all together and we denounced the fact that there was shark fin soup in the menu. And when we walked out, we really walked out, and then we did even we went further, and we wrote to Oceanwise, and we told them, this restaurant is serving shark fin soup. There has to be something to be done with this. And then that restaurant closed. So this was very, it was our little success story. But I think as consumers, we have to do these kind of things if we are to be able to push forward for sustainable seafood. Anyway, that was my story.
Thanks, Dang. And I think I'll end with just one more anecdote. We'll probably all know, maybe some of our audience will be far too young to remember this, but one of the first really huge stories in fisheries sustainable is dolphin safe tuna. And so that must have been the 70s that came in, I think. I know I was a kid, but I mean, dolphin safe tuna was one of those first big fishery certification, but kind of citizen science consumer choice. And it had a huge effect on how tuna were fished, just by people having that big campaign to change the practice of how tuna were captured to avoid capturing dolphins along in the purse seine nets. So I think those are some examples of where we can make a difference, both, at that kind of very large global scale as well as locally. And I think that's really what we're aiming to do within our citizen science survey that we're going to be doing over the next couple months, and then presenting back to you on a lot of these. What are the solutions? What can we do to increase sustainability? So what I wanted to do next is to hand over to Amy Clark, who's see if I can get this to move, who is going to introduce the survey that we've put together. And Amy has just completed an internship with us at the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, and she's also just joined the Aotearoa UNESCO Youth Leaders for a term of 2 years, and this group supports giving youth perspectives to UNESCO's priority areas. She has a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology and Environmental Studies from Victoria University, and she is now studying science communication at the University of Otago down in Dunedin. So thanks, Amy.
Kia ora koutou katoa. So I would like to present the Catch of the Day survey, which has been created to help inform these paired webinar sessions. The aim of the survey is that it will compile regional and international data on how consumers interact with the global fish supply chain. The data will then be used to showcase both the connection of fishery supply chains around the world and also the variability of fish stocks available to consumers. The survey objective is that this data will be used to drive more sustainable decisions by consumers, and also to help build a data set that will inform research and thinking in this area. So we plan on running the survey over a number of different rounds during the course of the decade to help examine overall trends throughout the UN Ocean Decade itself. So one of the exciting things about this survey is that it isn't just a passive writing exercise. The survey asks people to complete a citizen science activity by getting out into their local communities to investigate the fish that is available for them to buy. So in order to complete the survey, you're going to need to go shopping for fish, just as you normally would complete a food shop. You can complete the survey on your phone during your shopping trip or after you return home. Next slide, please. So this is the first section of the survey, and it's sort of asking participants about the choices of the fish that they see in the place that they're shopping, what's available to them during their shopping experience. And then the second page of the survey, next slide, please, sort of focuses more on what your decisions were, what did you purchase, if anything, why did you purchase this, the seafood that you purchased on that day, sort of to see what consumer decisions are currently across the world in different places. So we encourage anyone that's interested to get involved in this global citizen science project. In terms of how you can participate, the first round of the survey is open now and until the 15th of May, and then there will be rounds going forward in the future. So all participants in this webinar will be emailed a link to the survey after this webinar is finished, and the link has also been provided down in the chat box below. However, the survey is open for anyone to complete, and it will be available through the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO Ocean Decade website, Te Tēnea Tangaroa, and also on social media. If you follow the New Zealand National Commission on Facebook or Instagram, you'll also be able to find the link to the survey there. We encourage you to share and share the survey around so that as many people as possible can do it. We really look forward to analysing your responses for the first round of the Catch of the Day survey. The responses will then inform the second session of this webinar, which is happening during the Productive Ocean Virtual Lab in June. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to Caroline now to close the session.
Thank you. Oops. Thanks so much, Amy. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So we just want to thank everyone who came to the session, as well as our speakers. And I do especially now want to thank Amy. I know she's probably not as used to speaking in front of large audiences as the rest of us. So thank you, Amy. You did a fantastic job at introducing our survey and putting that together over the last few weeks. Again, thank you so much. We're hoping that we'll see you again in about 2 months' time when we have our second webinar, where we'll be showcasing those citizen science results. And then really our panel at the second webinar is going to include a diversity of actors in the fisheries world, from local producers to restaurants to scientists, and what their sustainability strategies are, and those kind of innovative solutions that people have come up with that we're hoping to then spread further around the world. So thank you very much, everyone.